Jacob didn't think much about taking the night shift at the Evergreen distribution warehouse. He was a practical man, and the money was good. His job was to oversee the inventory and ensure everything was scanned and accounted for before the morning crew arrived. The isolation of the warehouse didn't bother him, at least not at first. The warehouse was enormous, a labyrinth of metal shelving that reached up to the high ceiling. Every aisle looked the same, and it was easy to lose your bearings. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the rows of products. During the day, it was bustling with activity, but at night, it was a different world. Silent, vast, and unnervingly empty. Jacob's first night started uneventfully. Armed with his clipboard and scanner, he moved through the aisles, ticking items off his list. Around midnight, he took a break in the small, cramped break room. As he sipped his coffee, he heard it for the first time, a faint tapping noise coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. Tap, tap, tap. He paused, listening intently. It was rhythmic, almost like a knock, but it seemed to be coming from different directions at once. Jacob shook his head and chuckled nervously. Just the building settling, he muttered, trying to convince himself. He finished his coffee and returned to work. But as the night wore on, the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder and more deliberate, echoing through the cavernous space. Jacob tried to focus on his tasks, but his hands were trembling. When he moved a pallet into place, he noticed something strange. A single box sat on the floor, far from where it should have been. He frowned. He was sure he hadn't seen it there earlier. Picking it up, he checked the label. It was an old, dusty box that didn't match the current inventory. He placed it back on the shelf and decided not to think about it. Over the next few nights, the warehouse seemed to grow more menacing. Jacob couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was being watched. The tapping sound became a regular occurrence, always starting around midnight. It wasn't just the sound that unsettled him, it was the way it seemed to follow him, no matter where he was in the building. One night, as he moved through an aisle with his scanner, the overhead lights began to flicker. He stopped, waiting for them to stabilize, but instead, they went out completely. Jacob was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from his small flashlight. His pulse quickened as he pointed the beam of light down the aisle. For a moment he thought he saw movement, just a shadow, darting between the shelves. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "Is someone there?" No response. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the unease didn't leave him. As he continued his rounds, he noticed small things out of place. Boxes shifted slightly, tools lying on the floor, and once, a set of footprints in the dust that didn't match his own. It was around 3 a.m. when Jacob heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the upper level of the warehouse. He climbed the metal staircase, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As he reached the top, he saw something that made him freeze, a handprint on one of the dusty boxes. It was small, almost childlike. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The handprint was too clear, too deliberate to be an accident. He looked around, but the upper level was empty. Still, the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching him. The tapping sound returned, louder and more erratic. It echoed around him, coming from multiple directions. Jacob turned in circles, his flashlight darting across the shelves. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from below. He rushed down the stairs, his heart pounding. When he reached the ground floor, he found a pallet overturned, boxes scattered across the floor. But what caught his attention was a single item lying on top of the mess. A small, battered doll. Jacob stared at it, his breath caught in his throat. The doll was old and worn, with one eye missing and a crooked smile stitched into its face. "Where the hell did this come from?" he muttered, picking it up. The doll felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been left in a freezer. A chill ran down his spine, and he quickly set it aside. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Jacob couldn't focus on his work, his mind racing with possibilities. Was someone playing a prank on him? Or was it something worse? Jacob decided to report the incidents to his supervisor the next morning. But when he tried to explain what had happened, his supervisor dismissed his concerns. "It's an old building," the man said with a shrug. "Things creak and shadows play tricks on you when you're tired." Jacob wasn't convinced, but he didn't push the issue. That night, he came to work determined to ignore the strange occurrences. But as the clock struck midnight, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent than ever. This time, it wasn't just a sound. As Jacob walked through the aisles, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. A figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It was tall and thin, its body cloaked in shadow. Jacob froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side. Jacob took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he got closer, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. Jacob felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He wanted to leave, but he knew the doors were locked until morning. For the first time, he felt truly trapped. Jacob could no longer pretend that the strange occurrences were just his imagination. The figure he'd seen was too real, and the eerie tapping sound had started to take on a rhythm, almost like a message he couldn't understand. The once ordinary warehouse now felt like a living entity, its shadows pulsating with unseen energy. As the clock struck 3 a.m., Jacob found himself in the farthest corner of the warehouse. This area, called Zone 6, was rarely used, and the shelves were lined with dusty, forgotten inventory. He didn't know why he'd wandered there, but something compelled him to keep moving deeper into the gloom. The tapping began again, this time closer than ever. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like vibrations in the floor resonating up through his boots. Jacob gripped his flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. "Stop it!" he yelled into the darkness, his voice echoing back at him. For a moment there was silence, then a whisper. Faint and indistinct, it came from somewhere to his left. Jacob whipped his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing there. "Jacob," the whisper carried his name, soft but unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The whisper came again, this time from behind him. "Jacob, help us." He spun around, but the aisle was empty. Panic surged through him as the whispers multiplied, coming from every direction. They overlapped, growing louder and more frantic until they were a cacophony of voices pleading for help. Jacob stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking as he scanned the shelves. That's when he saw them. Faces. Dozens of pale, ghostly faces peering out from the darkness between the boxes. Their hollow eyes stared at him, their mouths moving in silent screams. Jacob ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed to get away from the faces, the whispers, the suffocating darkness. His boots echoed loudly on the concrete floor as he darted between aisles, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. But the warehouse seemed to shift around him, the aisles growing longer and more twisted. No matter which way he turned, he couldn't find the exit. The tapping sound returned, faster and more aggressive, like footsteps chasing him. Jacob skidded to a halt as he rounded a corner and nearly collided with the shadowy figure from before. It stood at the end of the aisle, motionless, its form indistinct but menacing. The air around it seemed to ripple, as if reality itself were bending to its presence. "Stay away from me," Jacob shouted, holding his flashlight up like a weapon. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. With each step, the tapping sound grew louder, pounding in Jacob's ears like a drumbeat. Desperate, he turned and ran again, his lungs burning as he sprinted toward the loading bay. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more chaotic. He could hear his name repeated over and over, mixed with unintelligible words. The warehouse felt alive, its walls closing in around him. Finally, Jacob reached the loading bay door. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to turn the key. Just as he pushed the door open, he felt a cold, clammy hand grip his shoulder. He turned to see the shadowy figure looming over him, its face a void of darkness. Before he could scream, it lunged at him, and everything went black. 2 weeks later, the Evergreen distribution warehouse posted a job listing for a night shift supervisor. The previous employee, Jacob, had vanished without a trace. His car was still in the parking lot, and his belongings were found neatly arranged in the break room. The new hire, a young man named Ryan, didn't think much of the strange stories the day shift workers told him during his orientation. He laughed off their warnings about the tapping sounds and the whispers. But on his first night, as he walked through the silent aisles with his clipboard, he noticed a strange box sitting on the floor. It was old and dusty with a battered doll perched on top. Ryan picked it up, frowning. From somewhere deep in the warehouse, he heard a faint tapping sound, and so the cycle began again. Angela had always preferred the night shift. As a single mother, it allowed her to spend her days with her son, and the solitude of the quiet hours suited her introverted nature. When she landed a job as a customer service rep for a 24-hour call center, she thought she'd found the perfect balance. The building was a 5-story structure tucked away on the edge of town. During the day, it buzzed with the hum of ringing phones and the chatter of employees. But by night, it transformed into a cavern of silence. Only 2 employees worked the graveyard shift, Angela and a janitor named Tom. On her first night, Angela arrived early, her footsteps echoing in the nearly empty parking lot. The building loomed over her, its windows dark except for the faint glow of her designated floor. As she rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor, she felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Her workstation was one of many in a sea of cubicles. She settled in, adjusting her headset and logging into the system. The calls were sparse, mostly late-night insomniacs needing help resetting passwords or placing orders. It was mundane, but Angela didn't mind. Around midnight, the first strange thing happened. The phone rang, not through her headset, but the actual desk phone in the cubicle next to hers. Angela frowned. That phone shouldn't ring. Each rep had their own line, and the office was empty save for her. She glanced around, half expecting to see Tom, but the janitor only ever worked on the lower floors. The phone kept ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. Angela hesitated, then stood and picked up the receiver. "Hello," she said. No answer, just static. Then, faintly, she heard a whisper. "Help me." Angela slammed the phone down, her heart pounding. She told herself it was just a prank. Maybe someone from the day shift had rigged the phone to mess with her. Still, the voice lingered in her mind. It had sounded desperate, almost pleading. Determined not to let it rattle her, Angela returned to her seat. The rest of her shift passed uneventfully, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fluorescent lights above her seemed too dim, and the shadows in the corners of the room felt too deep. The next night, things escalated. Around 1 a.m., she heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, the sound of heavy boots on tile. Angela froze, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Tom?" she called out, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped just outside her cubicle. Angela peeked over the partition, but the hallway was empty. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as a chill ran down her spine. She sat back down, trying to focus on her screen, when she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck. "Angela." The whisper was so close it felt like someone had leaned in to say her name. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her chair tipped over in her panic, clattering to the floor. She grabbed her phone and called Tom, her hands trembling. He answered on the second ring. "Tom, are you upstairs?" "No," he replied. I'm cleaning the lobby. Why? Angela hesitated. I thought I heard someone up here. Tom's voice dropped. You're the only one up there, Angela. Lock the doors. I'll come check it out. By the time Tom arrived, the floor was silent again. He checked every corner of the office, but found nothing unusual. Still, Angela couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. She thanked Tom and watched him leave, feeling a pang of guilt for dragging him away from his work. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time, it was her desk phone. Angela hesitated before answering, her heart thudding in her chest. Hello? Static filled the line, then a faint voice broke through. It was the same voice from the night before. Help me. Please, don't let it get me. Angela's blood ran cold. Who is this? Where are you? The line went dead. She stared at the receiver in her hand, her mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was someone really in danger? The phone rang again, but this time it wasn't her desk phone. It was every phone on the floor. Hundreds of phones ringing simultaneously, their cacophony reverberating through the empty office. Angela clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound was deafening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. Her computer screen flickered, and a message appeared on the monitor. He's coming. Angela grabbed her bag, ready to leave, but the lights in the office flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. The only light came from the emergency exit sign at the far end of the room. As she fumbled for her phone, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, coming from somewhere in the darkness. Who's there? She demanded, her voice shaking. The breathing grew louder, closer. Angela turned on her phone's flashlight and swept it across the room. The beam landed on a figure standing at the edge of the cubicles, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing red eyes. Angela screamed and bolted for the exit, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. The breathing followed her, along with the sound of heavy footsteps. She reached the stairwell and slammed the door shut behind her, but the footsteps didn't stop. They echoed down the stairwell, growing louder and faster. Angela raced down the stairs, her heart pounding. She burst into the lobby where Tom was mopping the floor. Tom, we have to get out of here, she cried. He looked up, his expression confused. What's wrong? Before she could answer, the lobby lights flickered, and the shadowy figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Angela froze as the shadowy figure began descending the stairs. Its movements were jerky, almost inhuman, and its glowing red eyes seemed to pierce through the dim light of the lobby. Tom turned toward the stairwell, his mop clattering to the floor. What the hell is that? He muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Run! Angela screamed, grabbing his arm. The two bolted toward the glass front doors of the building, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Behind them, the sound of the figure's heavy footsteps grew louder, faster, and closer. Angela yanked on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were automatic at night, requiring a key card to open. She fumbled in her bag, her hand shaking, as Tom grabbed a chair and hurled it at the glass. The chair bounced off harmlessly, the tempered glass refusing to give. The shadowy figure reached the bottom of the stairs, its presence suffocating. Angela could feel an unnatural coldness radiating from it as it stepped into the lobby. Tom grabbed her arm. The loading dock. It's unlocked at night. They sprinted toward the back of the building, weaving through hallways as the figure pursued them. The fluorescent lights flickered wildly, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. When they reached the loading dock, Angela shoved the door open and stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting her like a lifeline. Tom followed, slamming the door shut behind them. Is it gone? Angela gasped, clutching her knees as she tried to catch her breath. Tom shook his head. I don't know, but we need to get far away from here. They ran toward the parking lot, but Angela stopped short when she saw her car. Every window was fogged over, and written in the condensation on the windshield were the words, You can't escape." Angela's breath hitched as Tom stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the eerie message. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice shaky. Before Angela could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" The static on the other end was deafening, but through the crackling noise she heard the same desperate voice that had haunted her on the call center phone. "You shouldn't have stayed. It's too late now." The line went dead. Tom grabbed her shoulder. "We need to go. Now." They got into his van, locking the doors as the shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the parking lot. It stood motionless, its red eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Tom floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as they sped out of the lot. Angela kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching as the figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared. For a moment, the tension eased. The distant hum of the van's engine was the only sound as they drove down the empty road. But then Angela noticed something strange. The interior of the van grew colder and the windows began to fog up. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He glanced at her. "What?" Before she could answer, a handprint appeared on the windshield, on the inside. Tom swerved, nearly driving off the road, as the handprint was followed by another and another, until the glass was covered in them. Angela screamed as a shadowy figure materialized in the back seat, its glowing eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. Tom slammed on the brakes, sending the van skidding to a halt. The figure lunged forward, and Angela felt an icy grip on her shoulder. She screamed, the world around her spinning into chaos, and then... Jenna loved road trips. The open road, the freedom and the tranquility of driving through the countryside at night made her feel alive. On this particular evening, she was returning home from a weekend visiting friends in a nearby city. Her car cruised smoothly down the deserted highway, the hum of the engine and the soft tunes on the radio her only companions. It was just past midnight when her car sputtered unexpectedly. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, and the vehicle shuddered before coasting to a halt. Jenna groaned, pulling over onto the gravel shoulder. She stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at her skin. The stretch of road was eerily silent, with not a single car passing by in either direction. Looking around, she saw nothing but endless darkness and the faint silhouette of trees lining the road. Jenna popped the hood and peered inside, though she had no idea what she was looking for. The engine looked fine, but the car refused to start. Frustrated, she grabbed her phone, only to find that she had no signal. As she debated her next move, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over her as the vehicle slowed down and pulled up behind her car. A man stepped out, wearing greasy overalls and carrying a toolbox. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm and reassuring. Jenna hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, my car just died and I can't figure out why." The man smiled, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "Don't worry, I'm a mechanic. Let me take a look." The mechanic introduced himself as Dale and got to work immediately. He seemed confident and skilled, checking the engine and muttering to himself as he worked. Jenna stood to the side, watching him carefully. "You're lucky I was driving by," Dale said, glancing up at her. "Not many people take this road at night." "Yeah," Jenna replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. There was something off about him, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Dale straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Looks like your alternator's shot. I can fix it, but it'll take a little time." Jenna frowned. "Do you have the parts?" "Back at my shop," he replied. "It's not far from here. I can tow your car and get you fixed up in no time." Jenna hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to decline. But what choice did she have? She was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. "Okay," she said reluctantly. Dale smiled again, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. The tow truck ride was uncomfortable. Jenna sat in the passenger seat, her nerves on edge as Dale made small talk. He asked questions about her life, her plans, and why she was driving alone so late at night. The road twisted and turned, leading deeper into the woods. Jenna's unease grew with every mile. Finally, they arrived at a small, run-down garage nestled among the trees. The building was old and weathered, with a single flickering light illuminating the entrance. "This is it," Dale said, hopping out of the truck. Jenna followed him inside, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The garage smelled of oil and rust, and various tools and car parts were scattered everywhere. "Make yourself comfortable," Dale said, gesturing to a chair in the corner. "I'll get started." Jenna sat down, her eyes darting around the room. Something about the place felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. As Dale worked on her car, Jenna noticed something odd. There were pictures pinned to the wall, photographs of women, all taken at night. The faces were blurred, but the settings were eerily similar. Lonely highways, dark garages, and tow trucks. Her stomach churned. She needed to leave. Jenna stood up, pretending to stretch. "I'm just going to step outside for some air," she said, forcing a smile. Dale didn't look up from his work. "Sure thing. Just don't wander too far. The woods can be dangerous at night." Once outside, Jenna took a deep breath, the cool air calming her frayed nerves. She looked around, her mind racing. She couldn't just walk away. They were miles from civilization. But staying felt equally dangerous. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Jenna." She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Jenna, run." She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness. There was no one there. Panicked, Jenna ran back into the garage, determined to confront Dale and demand answers. But when she entered, he was gone. The garage was eerily silent, the tools and car parts undisturbed. Her car was still on the lift, but there was no sign of Dale. Jenna's gaze fell on a door at the back of the garage, slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. The room beyond was a makeshift office, cluttered with papers and more photographs. On the desk was a journal, its pages filled with scrawled notes. As Jenna flipped through it, her horror grew. The journal detailed years of encounters with stranded motorists, women who had disappeared without a trace. Her hands shook as she read the final entry. "She seems nice, quiet, easy to handle. I'll finish the job tonight." Jenna heard footsteps behind her and spun around to see Dale standing in the doorway, his expression cold and menacing. "You shouldn't have snooped," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth it once held. Jenna backed away, her mind racing for a way out. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Dale smirked. "Because no one ever notices. No one ever cares." He lunged at her, but Jenna grabbed a wrench from the desk and swung it with all her strength. The impact sent him staggering, and she bolted past him, running toward the tow truck. She climbed inside, locking the doors and fumbling for the keys. Dale pounded on the window, his face twisted in rage. The truck roared to life, and Jenna floored the accelerator, sending Dale sprawling to the ground. She drove until the garage was a distant memory, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she finally reached a gas station, she stumbled inside and called the police. Days later, she learned that the garage had burned down, and Dale's body was never found. But sometimes when Jenna drives at night, she sees a pair of headlights in her rearview mirror, always following, always watching. Mark adjusted his security badge and pulled his jacket closer against the biting wind. Midnight Mills loomed ahead of him, a hulking structure of brick and steel that seemed to defy the passage of time. The factory had been operational for decades, producing textiles by day and lying eerily silent by night. Mark's job was simple: patrol the premises during the graveyard shift, ensure everything was secure, and report anything unusual. Unusual things were rare, but not unheard of. As he entered the building, the air grew heavier. The hum of the machinery from the day lingered like a ghostly echo, filling the vast, empty space. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their glow casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. Just another night, Mark muttered to himself, his voice bouncing off the walls. He began his rounds, flashlight in hand, moving through the factory's labyrinthine corridors. The machinery stood still, their massive forms resembling slumbering giants. Despite the silence, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It started with small noises, a faint tapping, the shuffle of footsteps. At first, he dismissed them as the settling of the old building. But as the hours ticked by, the sounds grew louder and more deliberate. Mark reached the control room, a small office overlooking the production floor. From here, he could see the entire factory through a wall of windows. He settled into the chair and flicked through the security camera feeds. The screens showed empty hallways, static machinery, and deserted stairwells. Yet the unease persisted. Mark tapped the monitor, half expecting something to jump out of the shadows. A sudden crash echoed from somewhere deep within the factory. Mark jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the control room, following the noise. The sound led him to the weaving section, where massive looms stood in silent rows. One of the machines was running, its rhythmic clattering breaking the stillness. Mark frowned. That shouldn't be possible. The power to the machines was cut off at the end of each shift. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. The machine stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence once more. Mark's flashlight beam swept across the space, but he saw nothing unusual. Just rows of looms and the faint scent of oil and fabric. Mark returned to his rounds, but his nerves were frayed. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the vents felt amplified, as though the factory itself were alive. As he climbed the stairs to check the upper levels, he heard footsteps behind him. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. He spun around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The stairwell was empty. Mark's breathing quickened. "Who's there?" Silence answered him. He continued up the stairs, his grip tightening on the flashlight. At the top, he turned to look back down and froze. A shadow moved at the bottom of the stairs, shifting unnaturally against the dim light. It wasn't his shadow. It moved independently, slipping out of sight before he could process what he'd seen. Mark's mind raced. Was someone messing with him? A co-worker playing a prank? Or was it something else entirely? Mark decided to check the old offices on the top floor. These rooms hadn't been used in years, their windows dusty and furniture covered with white sheets. As he pushed open the creaking door to one office, he felt a rush of cold air. Inside, the room was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. Mark's flashlight revealed strange symbols scrawled on the walls, symbols that looked ancient and foreboding. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, stepping inside. As he examined the symbols, the door slammed shut behind him. Mark whirled around, his heart leaping into his throat. He yanked on the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and a low whisper filled the room. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping in a sinister chorus. Mark backed away, his pulse racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar. The room spun, and Mark felt himself falling to his knees. When Mark woke up, he was lying on the factory floor. He wasn't sure how he'd gotten there or how much time had passed. His flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam flickering weakly. As he picked it up, he heard the sound of machinery starting again. This time it wasn't just one loom, it was all of them. The factory roared to life, the clattering of machines echoing through the building. Mark ran toward the control room, hoping to shut down the power. But as he entered, he froze. Standing in the center of the room was a figure, its form shrouded in darkness. It had no discernible features, just a silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice a guttural growl. Mark stumbled backward, his mind screaming for him to run. The figure took a step toward him, and the lights in the factory flickered violently. Mark bolted, his footsteps echoing as he fled down the corridors. The sounds of pursuit, heavy, deliberate footsteps, followed him, growing louder with each passing second. Mark reached the main entrance and threw himself against the door. To his relief, it opened and he stumbled out into the cold night air. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Fumbling with his keys, he started the engine and sped away, leaving Midnight Mills behind him. The next day, Mark reported the incident to his supervisor. But when they checked the factory, everything was normal. The machinery was off, the symbols in the office were gone, and the security footage showed nothing unusual. Mark quit his job that same day, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, even in the safety of his own home. Months later, he learned the truth. Decades ago, a worker had died in a terrible accident at the factory. Since then, every night shift guard had reported strange occurrences. Some had even disappeared. Mark vowed never to take a night shift job again. But every now and then, he dreams of Midnight Mills, the whispers, the shadow, and the figure that warned him too late. Lena stood at the gate, but it still held an air of mystery. It was the perfect place to work for a young woman looking for solitude and a paycheck, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. As she approached the entrance, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place was off. The iron gates creaked as they opened, as if protesting her arrival. The weathered stone walls of the mansion seemed to loom over her, casting long shadows in the fading daylight. "You'll get used to it," the receptionist had told her during the interview. "The night shift's always quiet, and you'll have plenty of time to read or relax. Just keep to your rounds and you'll be fine." Lena had nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. She needed the job. But tonight, as the night shift was about to begin, those words echoed in her mind. After receiving her uniform and key to the front desk, Lena made her way into the dimly lit hotel. The lobby was grand, yet cold, with dark oak furniture and heavy velvet curtains. The large chandelier above her seemed to flicker slightly, as though it were struggling to stay alight. The first couple of hours were uneventful. She sat at the desk, reading a book, her eyes occasionally flicking to the monitors that showed the various rooms and hallways of the hotel. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, strange things started happening. At first, it was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Lena glanced at the clock. Midnight. She glanced around, wondering if someone had come in late. But the lobby was empty, save for her. She brushed it off, assuming it was the old building settling. But the tapping continued. It grew louder, and then a sound that made Lena's skin crawl. Footsteps. Lena's eyes darted to the security monitor, but there was nothing. The hallway outside was empty. The footsteps grew louder and closer, echoing on the marble floor. "Hello?" Lena called out, her voice shaky. No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside the door to the lobby, and for a long moment, there was complete silence. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stood, slowly approaching the door. She opened it with a creak, peering down the hallway. The hotel was as still as a tomb. There was no one in sight. She shook her head, confused. Maybe it was just her imagination. She returned to the desk, trying to ignore the nagging sense of dread creeping over her. As Lena sat back down, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A cold draft swept across her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She looked up at the overhead vents, expecting to see the air conditioning running, but they were off. The chill seemed to emanate from nowhere. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. As she tried to focus on her book, she noticed something strange in the corner of her eye. Movement. Lena glanced up and froze. There, at the far end of the lobby, she saw the faint outline of a figure standing near the grand staircase. A tall, thin figure in a long coat, staring straight at her. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. It was as if it had materialized out of thin air. Lena's breath hitched. She slowly stood up, her legs trembling. But when she took a step forward, the figure vanished. Gone. Lena stood still for a moment, her mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? She walked cautiously toward the staircase, but the air remained oppressively cold. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Trying to shake off her unease, Lena began her rounds. She checked the rooms, made sure everything was in order, and double-checked the security footage. But the atmosphere in the hotel had changed. It felt oppressive, like something was lurking just out of sight. As she passed a guest room on the second floor, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Lena paused, instinctively walking over to knock. She raised her hand but froze when she heard soft whispers from within the room. It sounded like a conversation, but the voices were faint, unintelligible, almost as if the people inside were speaking in a language she didn't understand. "Hello?" Lena called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside the room. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and the room appeared untouched. There was no one there. But then, a sudden cold draft swept through, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The room seemed to swirl around her, the air thickening. Lena stepped back, panicked, and rushed out of the room. She slammed the door behind her and backed away, her heart racing. By now, Lena was certain she wasn't alone in the hotel. The building felt alive with presence, shadows flitting at the edge of her vision, whispers curling into her ears. As she entered the restroom to collect herself, she stood before the large mirror above the sink. She looked at her reflection, disheveled, pale, and wide-eyed with fear. But then, as she looked closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, standing right behind her, was a woman. The woman was wearing an old-fashioned dress with dark, hollow eyes and a pale, lifeless face. Lena spun around, but there was no one there. The woman was gone. The restroom was empty. Lena backed away from the mirror, her breath shallow. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "This isn't real." But the feeling in her gut said otherwise. Something had been watching her from the beginning, something old and restless. And it was getting closer. Lena's shift was almost over, but the terror had escalated. The footsteps were constant now, echoing through the halls. The cold spots were everywhere, and the whispers were louder, clearer, almost as if they were trying to communicate with her. Desperate to escape, Lena ran down the hall to the exit, but the doors wouldn't open. The lights flickered violently, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The hotel had turned into a maze, every door seeming to lead to another dark hallway. She turned back, seeing the figure again, the tall, thin form standing at the top of the stairs, just watching her. The whispers returned, this time clearer than ever. They were speaking her name. Lena sprinted to the lobby, desperate for an escape, but when she reached the front door, it slammed shut in her face. The temperature plummeted. The lights flickered once more, and in the eerie silence she heard the words that would haunt her forever. "You shouldn't have stayed." The doors opened, but Lena didn't look back. She ran as fast as she could, never looking back at the cursed Greystone Manor. She never returned to the night shift. And the hotel? It was never quite the same again. It was a quiet, uneventful evening as Sarah walked into her first night shift at St. Clement's Hospital. She had just started as a nurse and was still getting used to the long hours and the eerily silent corridors of the place. The hospital wasn't the newest or the cleanest, but it had a certain charm, one that had attracted Sarah to apply in the first place. Her supervisor, a gruff man named Dr. Gibbons, gave her a brief rundown of the night's duties. "Nothing too complicated," he said. You'll just be handling rounds, making sure the patients are comfortable. But you've got to check on Mr. Thompson in room 307. He's not a pleasant one, but don't let him get under your skin." Sarah nodded, feeling a slight unease as she heard about Mr. Thompson. He was a long-term patient, known for his strange behavior and disturbing outbursts, but she didn't let it bother her. She had handled difficult patients before. The shift started, and Sarah made her rounds. Most of the patients were asleep, and the place was as quiet as a tomb. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the empty hallways. The clock ticked slowly, dragging the minutes into hours. At around 1 a.m., Sarah decided it was time to check on Mr. Thompson. Room 307 was on the third floor, at the end of a long corridor. As Sarah approached the door, she noticed the faint smell of something metallic but dismissed it as nothing. She knocked lightly before entering. The room was dimly lit, and at first, Sarah thought Mr. Thompson was asleep. He lay in his bed, his eyes closed, his face pale and drawn. But as she got closer, she noticed something strange. His breathing was shallow, and his body was unnaturally still. "Mr. Thompson?" Sarah called gently, her voice carrying in the quiet room. No response. She checked his vitals. His pulse was weak, and his temperature was abnormally low. She raised an eyebrow. It wasn't unusual for patients to experience fluctuations in their vital signs, but something felt off about this. Just as she was about to press the button for the nurse's station, a soft whisper came from the direction of the bed. "Go away." Sarah froze. The voice was low, hoarse, and filled with bitterness. She turned quickly, looking down at Mr. Thompson's still form. He hadn't moved. The whisper came again. "Go away." Sarah's heart began to race, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. She checked his vitals again, still weak, still cold. But as her eyes lingered on his face, she saw something in his expression, something that made her skin crawl. A faint, twisted smile had spread across his lips. Sarah backed away slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The air in the room had grown colder, and she shivered despite herself. "Mr. Thompson, I need to get the doctor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But before she could leave the room, the lights flickered. Then, without warning, they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Her pulse quickened, and she reached for the flashlight in her pocket. As she clicked it on, the beam of light illuminated the room in harsh, jerky flashes. Mr. Thompson's bed, which had been empty moments before, was now occupied. Only the figure in the bed was no longer Mr. Thompson. The figure was tall, thin, and unnaturally elongated, with pale skin that seemed to glisten in the flashlight's beam. It had the faint shape of a man, but there was something off about its proportions, something wrong with the way it sat up, its limbs unnaturally long and twisting. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward into the wall. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The thing in the bed slowly turned its head toward her, its eyes black and empty, with no trace of humanity left in them. "Get out," it hissed, its voice not Mr. Thompson's, but something deeper, older. Sarah turned and bolted from the room, her breath ragged in her chest. She had to get out of there, had to get to the nurse's station. She sprinted down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the stillness. But as she rounded the corner, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The hallway was completely dark, and standing at the far end was Mr. Thompson, or whatever had taken his place. It grinned at her, its teeth sharp and jagged, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Leave. Now." Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But every instinct in her body screamed that it was. She spun around and dashed for the stairs. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and she could have sworn she heard footsteps behind her, chasing her down. She pushed open the door to the stairwell and bolted down the stairs, her legs burning. Sarah reached the nurse's station on the first floor, breathless and panicked. She slammed her hand on the buzzer, trying to alert anyone who would listen. But when she looked around, the station was eerily quiet. There was no one there. She turned in a panic, rushing to the phone on the desk, but it was dead. The hospital had lost power, and she was alone, completely alone. Suddenly, a cold gust of air filled the room, and the lights flickered out completely. In the dark, Sarah could hear the sound of breathing, slow, deep, and ragged. It was coming from behind her. She whipped around, her heart racing. Standing just a few feet away was Mr. Thompson, or the creature that had taken his place. But this time it was not standing. It was crouched, its long arms stretched unnaturally in front of it. The grin on its face was wide, impossibly wide, and its eyes were two black pits that seemed to swallow all the light. "Leave," it whispered again, its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to scrape at Sarah's very soul. In the darkness, Sarah's mind raced for an escape. She couldn't stay in the hospital. The building was no longer a safe place. It had become a maze of terror, a hunting ground for whatever creature had taken Mr. Thompson's form. With no other choice, Sarah turned and sprinted out the front door, not stopping until she reached her car. She didn't look back. When the police arrived hours later, there was no trace of Mr. Thompson, or whatever had taken his place. Room 307 was empty, and the hospital was back to its usual sterile quiet. But Sarah knew what she had seen. She knew what had hunted her that night, and she would never be able to forget the empty, hollow eyes staring at her from the dark. She never returned to St. Clement's Hospital, and the police never solved the mystery of the disappearance. But Sarah would always wonder, was Mr. Thompson really the man she had seen, or something much darker, much older, lurking just beneath the surface of the old hospital's walls?